Hey, you guys seem to really enjoy the first one of these, despite me accidentally uploading a version that cut off the first few seconds. Yeah, that's my bad. But that aside, I figured I would do a follow-up for episodes 2 and 3. That said, things aren't going to be entirely the same, otherwise it'd get pretty repetitive if I just talk about style and energy and other things I covered in the first video. But suffice to say, those elements of the adaptation continue to impress. Things like Itadori and Nobara's Tokyo fantasies, or when Sukuna is briefly superimposed here for a moment, are fantastic. Instead then, for this video, I want to focus on something that was more prevalent in the second and third episodes than the first, that being anime original scenes and content. Anime original bits are nothing new when it comes to adaptations, and way back in my Demi-chan video, I talked about how original scenes and even small bits added to it made for a more cohesive and, in my opinion, better viewing experience. That said, Demi-chan and slice of life manga like it are not cut from the same structural cloth as Jujutsu Kaisen and your typical battle shonen. The latter is almost always more serialized, and therefore if anime original content is added, it typically isn't for more cohesion scene to scene or episode to episode. Instead, it'll often come in the form I discussed last time, that being extending fight scenes. And that is the first example we see in episode 2, but before we dive into that in earnest, I should mention the tiny bit of original content that was present in episode 1 that I didn't mention in the previous video. Near the start of the episode, we get this bit of context regarding Itadori's family situation as we see him calling the hospital about his grandpa. It's a short but nice piece of setup for the scene between them later, and the lighting in these brief moments is also reflective of that eventual tone shift I talked about that happens after that hospital scene. Alright, with that squared away, let's jump into the second and third episodes properly. With the beginning of the second chapter used in the first episode, this one picks up right where the last left off, with Gojo making his appearance, sweets and all, as he assesses the situation and briefly fights Sukuna. The lead up is pretty much exactly as in the manga, but as I mentioned, we do get a healthy amount more of this fight in the anime. And the original bits added here are awesome, only amplifying the greatness that is Satoru Gojo. The part where Sukuna leaps at him only for the dust to clear and reveal that Gojo is using him as a chair while nonchalantly continuing his train of thought is perfect. Last time, I mentioned how the changes made to Itadori's fight might cause viewers' perceptions of him to likewise change from what is conveyed in the manga. Some people in the comments disagreed with me, which is fine, but you'll be happy to know that these changes and additions I have no qualms with, because they are 100% in step with Gojo's character, and that makes it so enjoyable to watch. It's just exactly something he would do. The rest of the fight is also fleshed out about as well as it can be, considering it's only supposed to last 10 seconds. But the more that happens in those 10 seconds, with Gojo still remaining unscathed by the end, the better, because it only reinforces how untouchable he is, backing up his remarks about being the strongest. So all in all, some solid and appropriate additions. The episode then continues as it does in the manga, but I did really enjoy this film pause effect as we jump back from what was essentially one big flashback. Largely, the rest of the episode is the remainder of chapters 2 and 3, but with one significant difference. With Gojo having given Itadori his ultimatum, they head to the crematorium to pick up the remains of his grandpa. In the manga, they talk outside for a few pages before Itadori finds his resolve and swallows the second finger. In the anime, this dialogue is basically the same, except they add a brief scene with Itadori placing the remains of his grandpa in an urn. This is a significant addition for a few reasons. For one, I think it helps his grandpa's words of "you're a strong kid, so help people" resonate more and strike a chord with both Itadori and us as they play in his mind during this scene. And then there's also the cultural aspect to consider. Traditionally, the remains of the deceased are passed between family members before ultimately being placed in the urn. But here, of course, it's just Itadori, silently highlighting his situation while also reinforcing his grandpa's words about not ending up alone like him at the end of his life. It's a simple but masterful change that adds so much weight to his resolve immediately after this. From here, the episode proceeds without many more changes, barring a bit of an extension to Itadori's fight with the cursed doll. And while in episode 1 I griped about one of my favorite panels being changed in the anime, I'm happy to report that this one was adapted perfectly.
Itadori Yuji desu. Konami no type wa Jennifer Lawrence.
The only other change in this episode comes at the very end with Nobara. Instead of being introduced as she's getting off the train in Tokyo, we see her instead riding on her way leading up to the city. It's a small change, but with the context being that we won't meet her till the next episode, it makes sense to leave off here rather than with her already at her destination. So not too significant, but it does make for a good stepping stone to episode 3 as the original scenes added are focused on her. This episode covers chapters 4 and 5 and adapts them pretty much beat for beat. From Nobara's first appearance forcibly trying to get scouted to her taking out the cursed spirit, it's all done well. We also had a good amount of exaggerated faces from her that, based on how the anime had handled Chibi Itadori so far, I wasn't sure we'd get, but I am pleasantly surprised with how they were translated. Really helps Nobara's personality shine. And speaking of shining, this seems like a good time to mention it, I really like the depiction of Nobara's cursed energy. The edges remind me of the intentionally sketchier art style Jujutsu Kaisen can have at times, which is cool. And I'm interested to see if this color of cursed energy is universal or if we'll see other characters use different hues. Moving on though, there are only 2 real changes in this episode. One is a brief scene at the end, which is basically just an extension of the interactions with everyone at the end of chapter 5. But it is nice, and I think it helps to flesh out the developing bond between our trio of first years. It's fun, it's wholesome, and it juxtaposes really well with the dreadful cliffhanger at the end. Oddly though, they do jump back to the wholesomeness after the ED. I don't necessarily know why, but I'm not going to complain that we're getting more of it. The other change though is based around Nobara's backstory, and it's interesting because, like with the crematorium scene, dialogue-wise it's basically the same in the manga and in the anime, but what amounts to only 3 panels of mostly text boxes gets adapted into almost 3 minutes of Nobara in her hometown meeting and hanging out with Sayori. And visually speaking, what stands out to me is the fact that in the manga, we don't actually get to see what Sayori, much less young Nobara, looks like until literally 120 chapters later. Or in other words, more than 2 years later in weekly manga serialization time. But it's not like they just ripped out parts of chapter 125 and pasted them into this episode. As I said, it was basically just their designs. And I think this was done, 1, because chapter 125 came out only a week before episode 3, and so it feels like it was planned to some degree as kind of a nudge to people keeping up with the source material. Plus, there's no way they could have done this without Akutami's approval to begin with. They couldn't have gotten the designs otherwise. But also too, because aside from the background here and the focus on the suites, there isn't a lot to adapt from this very text-heavy page. Also, adding more visually speaking to Nobara's backstory works from an adaptation angle, while also selling us more on her desire to distance herself from that past as she clings to the memory of the person who made her aspire for more. I personally really enjoyed this part of the episode because it does what I think a good anime should, and makes you fall in love with these characters you've known all over again. And so far, that's worked for every one of these dorks. Overall, I continue to be really impressed with this adaptation. Everything has looked great, and the team behind it doesn't seem content with just recreating the manga one-to-one, but is actually working to elevate the source material. I'm hopeful this quality, both in style and pace, will continue as we go, because we are in for some really great moments if that's the case. Those are just my thoughts though, and as always, I would love to hear what you have to say. Are you still digging the Jujutsu Kaisen adaptation, or is there something you think I'm missing? Also, be sure to tag answers to this as spoilers for anime-only people, but is there anything from the manga you're really looking forward to seeing adapted? Those thoughts and any others you may have can be left down below. Thank you so much for watching though, and as always, an especially big thanks goes out to my awesome patrons, Overjoyed Soup, MV Pino, Cardrose, and everyone else whose support helps make videos like these possible. Links to that Patreon if you'd like to join them, my shirts, and everything else are either down below or on the screen right now. Be sure to hit that like button and click that bell for notifications so you know whenever a new video goes up. You can also follow me on Twitter or Twitch. Thanks again for watching, stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.